welcome to the Treasure House. It's very nice to see you all. It has been wonderful to work with the Philip Larkin Society for the development of the Home is So Sad exhibition, and it's amazing to have all the fantastic artefacts from the collection alongside the exhibition as well. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Phil Pullen and Graham Chesters here this afternoon to talk to us all. So without further ado, I shall hand it straight over to Phil. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming along. Can I just say that we have a very special guest here this afternoon, right at the back. That is Swift. She's training to be an assistance dog. She's a member of the Philip Larkin Society. And if I speak for too long, she'll start to bark. So just bear that in mind as well. Okay. Well, it's great to be here this afternoon, and it has been a really exciting, and is still a very exciting exhibition that we've got here in Beverley. And I think one of the particularly exciting features of that exhibition for me, and what interests me most about it, are things like the sense of place that it evokes, the association with home, and with everyday objects that we use to make sense of our lives. All these things are meat and drink to a Philip Larkin enthusiast. And Home is So Sad, the title of the exhibition, of course, is a short poem by Philip Larkin. I think that poem relates to all of the themes that I've just mentioned, and especially the concept of what happens to somewhere when we're no longer there and only the objects remain. And Larkin manages to capture that in a very simple 10-line poem. So I thought I would just start off by reading that to you, because it does seem to be so significant to what we're going to talk about this afternoon in the exhibition itself. Home is so sad. It stays as it was left, shaped to the comfort of the last to go, as if to win them back. Instead, bereft of anyone to please, it withers so, having no heart to put aside the theft, and turn again to what it started as, a joyous shot at how things ought to be, long fallen wide. You can see how it was. Look at the pictures and the cutlery, the music in the piano stall, that vase. Now, home for Larkin always meant family, and therefore, for most of his life, his mother's home in Loughborough, where she'd lived alone after becoming widowed in 1948. Larkin spent so much of his life not wanting to be there, or to be anywhere solid and restricting. If he had to be anywhere, at least it had to be on the edge of things, he said. And for him, home was often sad, and he was happier being outside of it, though always within touching distance as a dutiful son. Being away from home, especially what he saw as the family home, gave Larkin a sense of liberation and, I would say, freedom to explore. And his happiest years were spent in Belfast, the place he lived immediately before coming here to East Yorkshire. Belfast, for Larkin, was elsewhere. He literally felt like an outsider in Northern Ireland, in the Northern Ireland community. And he found it was a good place to write poetry, or at least the kind of poetry he wanted to write. In fact, the majority of the poems that make up The Less Deceived, the first mature book of poetry Larkin's published, most of those poems were written in Belfast, and they included the poem Places Loved Ones, which contain these lines. That, by the way, is the first object, really, that to influence this talk. That's Larkin's trunk that you see followed him to Holtby Hall in Cotting, which is the first place that he stayed briefly when he came to take up his post in Hull. Holtby Hall was and still is in Cottingham. So those lines from the poem, no, I have never found the place where I could say, this is my proper ground, here I shall stay. But it was actually in the East Riding of Yorkshire that Larkin came closest to finding that place, insofar as he spent 30 years of his life here. And it's my contention that it actually provided him with opportunities to explore place and landscapes more positively than anywhere else, at least over an extended period of time, that is. It helped him to generate a powerful poetic insight into a part of the world that did indeed suit him. The writer Blake Morrison has noted how many of Larkin's poems are about bumping up against fences and frontiers, against the limits of what is possible to be or do, given our nature, or the nature of existence. It seems, he says, that Larkin felt more comfortable on narrow ground, or within an island fastness. He mentions that Larkin liked to visit islands for holidays, for example. I think there's also a specifically geographical aspect to Larkin's positioning of himself. His attitude towards place has something to do with his upbringing. Not just his parents, though they were highly significant, but where he was born, smack bang in the middle of England. Larkin, like me, was born and brought up in Coventry, and there is nowhere in England further from the sea or from the boundaries of this island. A lot's been written about Larkin and place in relation to Hull and Larkin's own relationship to Hull. The many years spent in the top floor flat in Pearson Park, the image of Larkin in Springbank Cemetery that was shown in the 1964 BBC Monitor film with John Betjeman, for example, and the famous foreword he wrote for A Room at City, that great anthology of Hull poetry that came out in 1982. But I want to shift the focus slightly to encompass the whole of the East Riding, because I feel it allows us to understand in greater depth Larkin's particular relationship to place and how it featured in his writing. Larkin called the years between the ages of 20 to 40 the great fillet steak of life, after which, he said, you're on to the poorer cuts. Now, that was a phrase he used twice. Once to his mother during a tape-recorded conversation with her as to why he was too old to get married. He was 38 at the time. And 2 years later, to his lover, Monica Jones, who wanted to marry him. It was just after his 40th birthday, he was reflecting on what he saw as a life wasted. People live a lifetime a year compared with me, he told them. Now, Clive James, who I think is one of the greatest writers on Larkin, picks up on this aspect of Larkin's self-deprecating persona. The times when he seems to complain about being less than blessed, he wrote, are the very times when we should remember that he was more than human, with powers of registration verging on the divine. The everyday might have been full of things he found dull, but the everyday was his subject. We need to be very confident about our own everyday before we find him unexciting. And I think that takes us right back to the exhibition in many ways. Well, anyway, when Larkin arrived to take up his librarian post at Hull University in 1955, he was aged 32, the youngest university head librarian in the country, and therefore, even in his own terms, still at his prime, and perhaps at his most adventurous. I think it shows in the first couple of years he spent here, when he spent a considerable amount of time, particularly the weekends, exploring the surrounding countryside with a great deal of both physical and mental energy, even, you might say, zest. That's an extract from the poem Bridge for the Living that Larkin was commissioned to write to celebrate the opening of the Humber Bridge in 1981. So those lines were written 26 years after Larkin moved here. But I think they reflect much of the content of the letters that he wrote to friends and family during that time, recounting his journeys across the region. He visited most of the places that are on that tea towel map. That tea towel map, by the way, belonged to Larkin. It's one of about 30 that we've got at Hull History Centre. And I think he visited just about everywhere that's on that map. Now that poem, Bridge for the Living, is by no means his best poem. The earlier ones, such as Here, which mirrors in many ways, are much more impressive. But I think it does tell us something about his affinity for the place. And when you look at his correspondence over the preceding years, similar phrases leap off the pages as he travels around the area, and we'll hear some of those as we begin to look at those. But his early days here were not all that happy. He felt unsettled, regretting his move from Belfast, where everything had been quite comfortable for him. He didn't like Hull. At first, at least. It would be years before he came to discover what he called its sudden elegances. And he was living in unsatisfactory digs in Cottingham, upset by his landlady's blaring radio and the noise of other occupants. He spent his weekends getting away from all of that in the countryside, often by bicycle and sometimes by train. He didn't learn to drive until the 1960s. He made his first visit to Beverley on the 16th of April 1955, so only a few weeks after coming to Hull. He cycled the 6 miles or so across from Cottingham, a journey that left him feeling, he said, like a piece of perished rubber. Although initially he claimed that he didn't like the town that much, it hadn't made a great impression on him, he said. It was clearly not the case. He went on almost immediately to describe, for example, the lovely painted roof in St Mary's Church and the beautiful street of mansions and chestnut trees called North Barbeth Down. And Larkin would continue to visit Beverley on a regular basis, sometimes alone, sometimes with distinguished guests like the poets Vernon Watkins and C. Day Lewis, as well as bringing his friends and library staff here and hosting dinners at the Beverley Arms. And of course, he visited the art gallery to see the Elwells, as so many visitors to Beverley do, and to buy a drab Hully picture called Jenny's Cafe, which we'll hear much more about from Graham later on this afternoon. Now, Beverley was often the centre or the pivotal point in Larkin's journeys across the area, and I'm actually quite impressed by his stamina in those, and his fitness, obviously, in those early days. A lot of those journeys are recounted in the letters that he wrote to his mother or to Monica Jones. Take a couple of examples here. This one. I went a long bike ride in boiling weather, enjoying it in snatches. I went to Beverley in a roundabout way and had tea at the Beverley Arms, then went west in a long arc around the villages and wolds to Kirkella and Hessel. By the time I got back, I must have done nearly 20 miles and felt tired. No, those journeys weren't always positive. This one wasn't such a good afternoon, but I'm impressed by his stamina even more. I cycled to Oldborough this afternoon. Didn't mean to, but the wind almost blew me there. God, it is a dull, graceless hole. The bungalows are indescribable. One's called Hers and Mine, and another, Is He In? The ride was nearly 30 miles, and in the course of it, 6,000 turned up on my mileometer. Not far since 1939. All that one can say for Holderness is that it's flat. I apologise if anybody's come from Holderness today. He did actually say a lot more positive things about, and discover a lot more positive things about Holderness, but not on that particular occasion. Larkin, of course, was a keen photographer. And we can look at some of the ways in which he captured the area. These are two taken in Beverley of Monica Jones. That one on the left, which Hull History Centre has catalogued down as being the Minster, is actually outside St Mary's. I double-checked it before the exhibition, because it's in the exhibition. I'm not sure where that one on the right of Monica is. It feels to me that it might be somewhere around Seven Corners Lane, but I'm not absolutely certain. But it's in Beverley anyway, somewhere. And this one, this is Swanland. He made a trip to Swanland in May 1955, and he captured that visit in an unpublished letter to Monica Jones. And I think it shows us something about Larkin's quite complex attitude towards place and homemaking. This is what he had to say. There was a bird catching insects over the water, and every now and then it would swoop right into the water with a splash. Up by the post office was a big lump of granite that was at a plate on the wall said must have been rolled down by the ice cap 300,000 years since. Remounting, I went on to North Ferriby and lay on the bank, watching the muddy Humber rippling and swirling by. Then I came home through Heston. My thoughts, this is to Monica Jones, my thoughts were never far from you, and I wished you'd been with me to see all the interesting and beautiful scenes I saw. There was a lot to tell you, most of which is gone now, but chiefly that I long for you to be at my side, showing you the new districts. I could see across to Lincolnshire, plain as anything. This was quite distinct from the morning when I walked round the village, i.e. Cottingham, feeling like a man walking to the scaffold. Strangeness. It's like a tight, ill-fitting shirt, one that doesn't give at all. I've no talent for making a home, wherever I am. I dread moving, dread finding, it won't do. So here are some more photographs taken by Larkin of the villages around the upper reaches of the Humber and Ouse. And on the right there, that car that's parked on the road in Laxton, I suspect might well be Larkin's car. Larkin didn't learn to drive until 1964 at the age of 42. And I wonder whether it was his growing fame and wealth at that time that might have had something to do with it, because before then he decried the whole idea of motoring. This is what he wrote to Monica in 1955. While a lot of people have cars these days, I feel I never shall. I haven't the personality for one. And the prospect of the roads in a few years' time is appalling, and indeed the country generally. Well, Larkin did buy a car. His first car was a Singer Gazelle, later replaced by a massive Rover Van den Plough. And this was used to travel around the area. It made travelling around the area obviously much easier, albeit more hazardous on occasions, both for Larkin and for fellow road users. So he had a car by the time he made this trip to Lockington, quite a famous visit to Lockington. You may have seen this photograph before. It was May 1969, and it was at Lockington Church. It brought together those four English poets. Richard Murphy there on the left, a friend of Larkin, who at the time was holding the post of Poet-in-Residence at the University of Hull. He'd hired a cottage in Lockington adjacent to the church belonging to the writer Malcolm Bradley. And on Saturday the 17th of May, Murphy invited Larkin, Douglas Dunn, who's seen there next to Murphy, and Ted Hughes to lunch. And Larkin took that photograph of them outside the church. I don't suppose you know Ted Hughes, he told his mother. He's as famous as I am, only younger. A great thug of a man. Never does any work. I rather envy him. And it's quite interesting, actually. I went out to Lockington a few weeks ago to have a look at this cottage that Bradbury and Richard Murphy had hired. It's hardly a cottage, it's half the rectory. It's rather splendid there. But the most exciting thing, and discovered this sometime last year, via a kind of interesting link between Guernsey, where I was giving a talk, and Lockington, from somebody who used to live in Lockington, was now living in Guernsey, had sent me a picture of the signatures of those four poets in the parish visitors book. And that visitors book is actually in the treasure house now. It's in the archives, and we brought it out of the archives into the exhibition. And I don't think it's ever been seen by the public before, so that's really exciting. Okay, so these visits that Larkin was making across the East Riding brought out some of his greatest prose, I think. This is about a visit he made to Warne. I did go out on Sunday for a brief time when I was free of cars and motorbikes and enjoyed myself a lot. The cottage gardens are all purple and red and gold, hedges full of hips and haws and elderberries, and now again a pale pink wild rose. I stopped at Warne and poked about the churchyard, turning up chestnuts in the grass. And then noticing that little detail there about the gravestones, George Dooler, who had outlived two wives before dying in all three identical tombstones. That was a very Larkin-esque afternoon. And another very special day trip Larkin made was to the villages around the upper reaches of the Humber and the banks of the River Ouse. including the village of Blacktop. Now these are my photographs, not Larkin's, but it's kind of interesting. He said, I went into Blacktop, but it was nicer outside than in. It had a queer deserted church hall by its gate, erected in 1851, extended in 1873, which looked completely overgrown and neglected. But inside I could see trestle tables laid for tea, as if for some outing that never came. Now I visited that village hall in 2013, and that's what I found inside. Some of those trestle tables are the originals, I suspect. So they're still out there. And you can actually still get a cup of tea there. The brilliant thing about going to Blacktop is that they've got tea making facilities which they just invite anyone who comes into the hall to make their own tea and and pay on the basis of just being trusted to pay their way, as it were, which is great. This is another of my photographs, but Larkin's words. They come from the end of that wonderful poem Here, where it goes right through Hull and out through Holderness. Larkin's journeys then took him to the Far East, not as far as China, but he would have liked to have gone to China, of course, if he could have been there and back in a day, that's what he said, but to Spurn Point. And I think this takes us back to Larkin's attitude towards place and what he wanted to achieve, poetically. His aim, he said, at one point, was to remove himself from his poetry, from the scene he was describing. And he did this successfully on several occasions, in several poems, but I think no more powerfully than here. His is a removed life clarified by loneliness, to paraphrase another line from the poem. And as Douglas Porteous, a geographer, pointed out, nowhere is the place Larkin really wants to be. Larkin himself said, as for Hull, I like it because it's so far away from everywhere else. On the way to nowhere and beyond, there's only the sea. Okay, well, in a sense, this is where he ended up. Here we are in Larkin's final anthology of poetry, High Windows, and the poem High Windows. And all he can see is what's not present. Rather than words come the thought of high windows, the sun comprehending glass, and beyond it the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. He finally then got his nowhere, something, somewhere, words can't fully describe. And we're also back to the exhibition. I've actually juxtaposed the view from Larkin's famous high windows in his Pearson Park flat with the painting by Sam Robinson in the exhibition, that one at the bottom there. Sam has explored the view from another set of windows looked out from by Larkin, those of 200 Hallgate in Cottingham, one of his temporary lodgings when he first came here. Now that building is long gone and has been replaced by a block of flats. But by dint of internet research from 5,500 miles away, I should say, in South Korea, Sam managed to find an image taken from the windows of one of the flats, looking out onto the frontage. It was actually from an estate agent's catalogue. Sam's impression of the view was drawn day after day, he tells us, over 6 months. And it seems to me to represent what Larkin finally saw and how that impression changed day after day, looking out from his high perch in Pearson Park. An image of both sadness and extreme beauty. I love the way that Clive James expresses what this process is about and what Larkin himself, though definitely an artist, had achieved. This is what Clive James says. All the evidence, and most of it in his poetry, suggests he could hear the fizz when the light hit the window. Wasn't it an amazing way of putting it? Hear the fizz when the light hit the window. Now Larkin finally ended up almost housebound. In the latter part of his life, Jonathan Raeburn, a travel writer, made a visit to Hull and found Larkin, now moved to a house on Newman Park, restricted to a very small walkable triangle. His house, the local shops, and the university library. But oh, what a journey it had been, and what beauty along the way. Thank you very much. Well, Swiss barking was telling me that I was reaching the end. So just about. I think we've got time for a few questions, Sarah, before we move on.
You say a bit about his end. You say he was restricted. Three traces, but he was
physically, he deteriorated quite a lot towards the end of his life. I mean, he was always profoundly deaf. We got deafer and deafer, but he got heavier and heavier as well. So his health wasn't too good. I don't know whether we still got these in the Larkinalian, Graham, but there were 2 walking sticks left in Newman Park, weren't there, when Monica Jones died. They would be seen walking around Cottingham on sticks. So physically, he couldn't get about as much, although he had a car, drive that way, but he wouldn't have been making those journeys, those longer journeys out there. Most of them are kind of concentrated in the first few years that he lived here, actually. Very rich years, 1955 to 56, for getting to know the area. I suppose, as you would expect from being in a new part of the country.
Did he explore Belfast as well?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in a way, Belfast was the sort of model that you then took on for exploring Hull, because he cycled a lot in Belfast, and Belfast isn't like Hull. It's not flat. There are hills, it's surrounded by hills. But he would cycle out, you know, to the Lagan and various places. Particularly when he first got there, he'd be cycling out to the local towns. So he did a fair amount of exploring in Belfast too. That was, of course, a further stage away from both his mother and Monica, possibly a little bit too far. And Hull was far enough. It was comfortable for getting back to Loughborough and getting to Leicester and coming back to Hull.
How much did he share all of this with his partners? Did they accompany him on these various visits around?
Shared it with Monica a lot. One of his partners, Maid Brennan, of course, was brought up in Beverley, and she would accompany him on quite a few of the Beverley visits, for example. He'd tell his mother about a lot of these things. And then, of course, he would bring other friends there. Jeff, who's sitting in the audience, he was worked in the library with Larkin. I think you told me when he came on the walk that you were one of those people that would go to those dinners at the Beverley Arms.
Yes, it was the excuse me, library staff committee used to take each year to the Beverley Arms.
Yeah. So no, he delighted in telling other people how nice the area was. Jeff?
There is an unpublished letter from Larkin to Monica Jones where he describes a drive out to Easington on a beautiful autumn day, and he's so taken by it that he actually contemplates renting a cottage
Really?
and commuting into Hull every
That's
day.
interesting.
He didn't actually pursue it, but
No.
he did contemplate the idea.
He did think, I think initially, about moving to Beverley as well, but he thought it was too busy and too large and too far. He says too far, which means from the university. As he didn't fancy cycling there every day. But okay,
I
yes,
seem to recall as well that Larkin used to go out with Betty Macariff.
yes.
And would that again have been predominantly the East Riding when they went to
Yes,
the
well, a bit
trips?
further sometimes. They got to North Yorkshire as well. But Betty tells an interesting story about when Larkin was learning to drive. She would take him out in her car, and she said that they came to Beverley one day, and they were turning around into Hengate here, around that bend in Hengate, and there were all these pedestrians having to scatter out of the way as well, and hurtle down Hengate. You can imagine the headlines in the local newspaper. Eminent poet kills 4. You know. Yeah. Okay, well, that's probably a nice point to end, isn't it?
Yes.